It's rare that we get national unanimity on anything, but having, as you say, the 9 education ministers agree on things is quite the challenge. However, almost 5 years ago now, they agreed on establishing what they described then as a National Evidence Institute, that having the research available to them to inform their decision-making about education would be a better way to go than just kind of crossing your fingers and hoping for the best and hoping that goodwill and good intentions and old habits might do the trick.
You're listening to Around the School Table, hosted by me, Steve Davis, and proudly powered by Zuno Suite. We'll be bringing together the many voices shaping primary and secondary education across Australia, from principals and teachers to education thought leaders and system innovators. Whether you're in the classroom, the staff room, or the boardroom, this is your podcast to be informed, inspired, and connected. Today on Around the School Table, our guest is Dr. Jenny Donovan, CEO of the Australian Education Research Organisation, AERO, Australia's national evidence body for education. Drawing on decades of experience from classroom teaching to leading large-scale research, Jenny's working with ministers across every state and territory to ensure that what happens in schools is grounded in what actually improves learning. And in the conversation we're about to have, she'll be unpacking AERO's push for stronger initial teacher education, explicit instruction, and evidence-based classroom management, alongside a growing focus on equity, disability, and First Nations education. So if you're an educator, curious about research in a way that can genuinely lighten the load for teachers and lift outcomes for students, I think this is going to be essential listening. Jenny, welcome to Around the School Table.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be with you, Steve.
Now, I believe you have 9 bosses, and I know who they are. At the time of recording, they're Federal Minister Jason Clare, the 8 state and territory ministers, Prue Carr, Joe Hersey, Yvette Berry, John Paul Langbrook, Blair Boyer, Joe Palmer, Ben Carroll, Sabina Winton. What's it like navigating priorities across all those jurisdictions, and how do you maintain coherence when the national narrative on education can just vary so widely?
Well, what a great question. It's rare that we get national unanimity on anything, but having, as you say, the 9 education ministers agree on things is quite the challenge. However, almost 5 years ago now, they agreed on establishing what they described then as a National Evidence Institute. They all agreed that having the research available to them to inform their decision-making about education would be a better way to go than just kind of crossing your fingers and hoping for the best and hoping that goodwill and good intentions and old habits might do the trick. So I have 9 bosses. They actually delegate line management of me to the independent chair of AERO's board, who's Dr. Lisa O'Brien. But I do try and communicate with all of the ministers every year, because every year they set the priorities for the work that AERO will do. So they identify for me what their educational challenges are and the areas that they would like us to focus on. So it's important for me to be in touch with them and understand what their particular priorities might be. They don't always line up. And so part of the task for me is to negotiate with their senior officials, the heads of their departments, to arrive at the core priorities that are common, that are shared, and that would be productive lines of inquiry and work for AERO to do, so that, as you can say, we can give them really good information, insights, and increasingly practical advice about how we can go about improving education.
The way you painted that picture for me took me back to when I used to work a long time ago with wine exporting, and my holy grail was to find one back panel for all the warnings about wine that would work in every jurisdiction around the world, and it eluded me. It was never possible. With education, is there such a holy grail you can strive for that you think is practical and achievable of complete uniformity? Or are there actually kinks in the hose, as it were, that require differences here and there?
Look, I think what we have been able to demonstrate in the years now that we've been operating, we were set up in 2021, so we're not even 5 years in yet, is that the research is extremely robust in relation to what are the practices teachers can use that will lead to learning success for their students. Now, that to me is the holy grail. This is the reason we have schools. It's because we want children to learn. And we agree as a society what it is we want them to learn, and that becomes our curriculum. And the people who implement that curriculum are the teachers. The teachers are the main factor in whether or not a child learns successfully. And what we've demonstrated is it is the things the teachers do that will make the difference. And if teachers know about that, if they understand the why some things work better than others, if they know how to do the things that work well, really well and with confidence, we're absolutely going to see increased learning success among all of our students.
I'm going to come back to that in just a moment, but I can't get too far into this conversation without referencing Gonski, because AERO was born out of the Gonski review, where outcomes didn't really match the investment, if I'm allowed to say that. And I've heard you say that education isn't quite the great leveller in Australia that we hoped it would be. Can you tell me why we didn't perhaps see the results that were expected? And is this why one of the focus points moving forward will be on equity and how some schools bucked the trends?
Yes, it's quite an interesting backstory, I think, because way back in 2011, when David Gonski led the first panel to look at how we fund education, it came up with the quite correct observation that in areas of disadvantage, there is a need for more money to be provided. However, it turned out that just putting money out there didn't solve the problems that were intended to be resolved. We knew that children come with different levels of advantage. We knew that children were at different levels of achievement in their learning. We thought that if we allocated money on a needs-based funding formula, that would solve the problem. But of course, what we understand now is it's what you do with the money that makes the difference. It isn't just having the money. A bit like just having research isn't going to improve outcomes. You need to do something with it. So Gonski's second panel in 2018 was designed to look at how should the money be spent? What are the most effective things to do with the education dollar if your goal is to improve learning outcomes of students? And one of the things that they saw was the work that I was then doing in New South Wales in the Department of Education, where I led a research agency called the Centre for Evaluation, Education Statistics and Evaluation. And they saw the work that we were doing to identify the practices that work well, that effect improved learning outcomes for students. And the Gonski panel said, this is something that we need nationally. This is giving us the guidance that we need to be able to really shift the dial on those things that are really long-standing challenges in education. The equity gap that exists and the apparent decline in learning achievement of our children. And you're right, we've always had this fond hope that education will be the great leveller, and the reality has been for quite some time now that that is not the case. Children arrive at school with disadvantage, and instead of being on a learning trajectory that matches their more advantaged peers, their learning trajectory is flat or declines, while the advantaged children's learning trajectory improves. So we actually end up widening equity gaps over the course of their schooling. And that is completely antithetical to what the ministers are hoping for. And the good news is we know how to fix that.
Yes, because it is intuitive to think more money into the areas of lack will be a magic solution. And then we have the inconvenient truth. Back in episode 3, I interviewed Craig Ainsworth from Westport Public School in a lower socioeconomic region in New South Wales. They've become reigning chess champions for 18 odd years against some of the most well-funded, prestigious schools in Sydney. This perhaps is what you've just talked about is a different lens for evaluating that just the absence of resources doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have suboptimal outcomes.
It is all about the teaching and the approach to the teaching. So you will find that in some of the more resourced schools that they're able to attract extremely experienced teachers who are using the approach to their practice that is successful. And chances are Westport is using an approach to their teaching that is highly successful. It's the teaching that makes the difference. The teachers are the special sauce.
In fact, you're quoted as saying the teacher is the primary factor in terms of learning, which is a very powerful assertion. But I believe you found through your research that there is some inconsistency in the training of teachers, and you've recommended focusing on 4 areas. One of them is classroom management. Can you walk us through the others?
Yeah, look, happy to. This was an interesting opportunity that came up quite early in the life of AERO when there had been a review of the quality of initial teacher education and a generally damning finding that initial teacher education around the country was inconsistent and was delivering graduates who were not perceived as being classroom ready and not necessarily carrying the knowledge and skill that they needed to be successful practitioners. So the opportunity I had was to join Mark Scott's TEEP panel, the Teacher Education Expert Panel, to look at the problem and come up with some recommendations for solutions. And the main recommendation, which was picked up by all of the ministers, again, a point where they unanimously agreed, and that was to develop core content for initial teacher education. And the chance there was to bring our research to bear on what is it that every teacher absolutely needs to know. What is it that is foundational and fundamental to their practice, no matter whether they're going into a primary or a secondary setting, whether they're teaching maths, English, humanities, etc. What do they all need to know about and be able to do to be successful teachers in classrooms? And we identified 4 areas that are really important for them to all know about and be able to do. One is to understand brain science, to understand how children learn, how humans learn, because our brains are designed to learn in a certain way. And if you understand that certain way, it makes a whole lot of sense of the kinds of teaching practices that are really successful when it comes to learning. So cognitive science tells us that we've got incredibly powerful brains, but they get overloaded really quickly with new information. So as a teacher, all you're doing is transmitting new information every day, all day to children. You need to be conscious of how to do that in a managed and sequenced and structured way so that you don't continually overwhelm them and run the risk that everything that you're trying to teach is not being embedded into their long-term memories. That's where we need them to be building up their knowledge so that we can get new knowledge in there and it sticks to what they already know. And this is how we go about creating children who can become creative, critical thinkers, problem solvers, etc. Because what we've done is carefully establish a robust body of knowledge in their long-term memories. So teachers, prospective teachers need to understand that that's how learning happens. And then they need to understand what are the effective practices they need to use as the teachers in the classroom. And what the core content in initial teacher education will be teaching them is that they need to be very explicit in their practice, that you can't run the risk in the classroom of saying, children, let's follow your interests, or children, you are naturally curious. why don't you go and discover the information for yourselves? That sounds delightful, but it leads to a whole lot of, and eventually, frustration and distraction from the children. What the teacher needs to be doing is being very clear about what is our curriculum, what is the information that I want you to learn, how are we going to go about doing that, here's how we're going to step it out, here's what you already know, and we're going to be building on that, and then I'm going to give you opportunities to work with me to use this new information, and then I'm going to set you free to have a go at doing it independently, and we'll see how you go. So it's taking a really conscious, deliberate, explicit approach to managing the way the teaching is done in order for the students to learn. And as you noted, the third part is classroom management. A big important part of being an effective teacher is managing the environment for learning to happen. So it's about understanding that you need to set rules and routines. You need to provide an environment that is consistent and predictable, where every child knows what are the expectations. If I need help, what are the rules? Do I put my hand out, or do I just leap out of my desk, leap away from my desk and be disrupted? Establishing the environment that the learning is going to happen, and making sure that the students understand it, that you teach that to them explicitly as well, and that you enforce that, you maintain consistency about that, is incredibly important, and surprisingly not something that has been explicitly taught to our trainee teachers to date. All of these changes are imminent. They will be coming in over the course of 2026. So it's very exciting times in initial teacher education. A lot of hasty changes being made to courses as we speak. And then the fourth area of focus for initial teacher education is looking at what we've called responsive teaching. So making sure teachers understand the children that they're working with, understand who they are, what are their characteristics, what are their family backgrounds, the language backgrounds, are they First Nations children, are they children who might have additional needs or disabilities. So making sure that teachers are ready to work with the diversity of learners that they're going to have in their classrooms. So it's core content that is absolutely critical information, knowledge that every teacher moving into a classroom needs to have. And to date, that hasn't been a guarantee. They haven't been the areas that have been focuses necessarily.
My goodness, those are four key areas. They, I think, paint beautifully the profound depth that is required of a human endeavouring to become a teacher, because I believe it's one of the most noble professions we have. It's little valued, sadly, in society for the deep impact it has on all of us. I just want to put on the table, from a layperson's perspective, the two things that I see that I think find a home in those key things. And one is the teachers who impacted me the most, Mr. Murphy and Ms. Fagan, lit or fueled my already nascent flame of curiosity, and they also coaxed me out of my shell. Especially for the fourth factor, I believe that's such an important X factor that teachers bring to the role of teaching that is possibly hard to prescribe.
Absolutely. And yet we need to understand that teaching is a relational profession. Teachers need to understand the people that they're working with. And so it's very important for them to be able to recognise what is it that they will need to take into account as explicit teachers, that, you know, they know how to deliberately implement the curriculum and to make sure that the children learn it, but the children themselves are going to be all different. They're all coming from slightly different places. They're all going to learn in exactly the same way. So the recipe for explicit instruction is going to be the successful recipe for all of them, but some of them are going to need it in different kinds of doses. Some of them will move more quickly. Some of them might need additional support in terms of extra time or even one-on-one tutoring or withdrawal from the classroom. There are other things that teachers will be able to make sure is available to the students who might need that. But it begins with knowing who the students are, where their starting points are, so that you target what you're doing appropriately. Because there's also no point, saying, here's our curriculum and I'm going to teach it no matter what, to children, for example, who are already proficient readers. You can start at a different point with those children. Learning to read is, fundamental and the very first thing we need to pay attention to. But if you're teaching a talented group of children who've arrived at school with certain proficiency, then you as the teacher can make the judgment that I'm confident we can move to this next thing in their learning and accelerate things. Similarly, you sometimes need to move slower than the curriculum might anticipate, because some children are going to come to school without English language proficiency, not having been in a formal environment before, so they can take a little time to adjust to the classroom management expectations, etc. But this is the attractive part about teaching. It is not a formula where every day is predictable and the same. Every day brings something new. It brings new rewards. It brings new challenges. What the core content and what our message to all teachers about explicit instruction is, we can take away from you the guesswork about what might work. We know what's going to work, but you as the professional are going to judge the pace that you do that and the way you accommodate the learners in your classroom as you roll out that curriculum.
So this AERO approach is to have that rigorous framework, but still give the teacher agency for determining pace and where and how that's applied. But they know the rubric within which things work. Is that fair?
Absolutely. The teachers are professionals. As you say, it is an underrated and yet incredibly important profession. What would we do without them? They rightly claim very often that they feel overworked, and I think that's a lot to do with the fact that we haven't made some information really clear to them. It hasn't been the case, as I said, through the initial teacher education, nor in practice when they're in schools, that there is a way to do this work which makes it manageable, and where we can give you really clear advice, professional learning, guidance, support, coaching, etc., to help you understand it and do it really well. This is starting to happen, and I'm proud to say that this is in part because AERO exists, to be able to make these pronouncements, to say the research tells us, and then we never stop at, and here's the research, look at the website, off you go. We take it to, and here's how you can do it in your practice. Here's a practice guide. Here's a checklist. Here's an observation sheet. Here's a video of somebody who's doing it brilliantly. And they're working in a very disadvantaged environment, so maybe they look a bit like you and the students you're working with. Have a look at that, and we go as far as we can to provide the support that we know they'll need.
Still wrestling with clunky reports? Switch to Acceleris, the gold standard in school reporting. From semester to continuous reporting, design stunning reports in Word, pull data from multiple sources, and share with a click. Easy, flexible, beautiful. Acceleris. Love at first report. Visit xuno.com.au.
That leads us to peer-led training, where one teacher learns and then trains others, which can, at least in theory, replace costly off-site programs. You've conducted some randomised controlled trials about what really works in scaling professional learning without losing depth. What can you share with us? What have you discovered?
We're very interested in professional learning because, having identified that teachers are critical and what they do is extremely important as well, because you can have teachers with great intentions who are wasting their students' time because they're not doing the right sorts of things that will lead to learning. The the mechanism that we have to enable teachers to learn as they're working is professional learning. And every teacher has an entitlement to professional learning, and every system has a responsibility to make professional learning available. So we're interested in professional learning. The risk at the moment is that it isn't all terribly effective, that people can choose to do professional learning, which is not great and is not going to help them be better practitioners, that they do professional learning, which takes them out of their classroom for a day or more. They go back to the classroom and nothing changes. So we've been having a really close look at the kinds of professional learning that work really well and how can we make that professional learning more attractive, less costly, scalable, available to teachers who might be in remote regional locations, etc. And you're right, we looked at certain models where train the trainer models might replace the need for teachers to leave the classroom, which creates disruption for their students and their learning and means that the schools have to replace them with casual teachers, etc. So where we can find models of really excellent professional learning that might be adapted to be provided using a train the trainer model or using online delivery. We're really interested in exploring the potential of that. We have looked at some which has been very successful. There's a specific train the trainer model which is working terrifically in early childhood education, for example. We've looked at some which haven't been successful, and we've been surprised to learn that, for example, professional learning provided to teachers where it was provided to the teachers in practice. We worked in WA with about 100 teachers doing a certain professional learning program. We wanted to test whether or not if you gave those teachers professional learning and then offered a booster to some teachers 6 months later, that would help that professional learning to stick better and make them even more confident in what they'd learned and how they were practicing it. So the professional learning was provided to these teachers. 6 months later, we came in and offered them a booster, which was 2 90-minute sessions. And then we measured the impact of that both at the beginning, at the baseline, at the point where they got the booster, and then another 6 months later. And it was very interesting to us that at that 12-month point, 12 months since half of the teachers had a booster opportunity and half had not, there was no difference in their performance. So what that tells us is that some things that intuitively we think, oh yeah, that would work, surely that would help. Actually, when you test them rigorously, and we used a randomized controlled design methodology, it didn't improve the outcomes in the way that we thought it might. So what we've done now is publish this research that suggests, hold on, if that's what you thought might make the difference and make your professional learning even better, that might not be the thing that does it. There might be other things that you would look at to make your investment in instead.
I imagine some state treasurers just leaned in thinking, here's a chance for a reverse Gonski, and we can take some money off the table at that 6-month point. But I guess you'd find better ways of making use of that actually worked.
Well, absolutely. And we have another 4 professional learning experiments in the field at the moment that we will be reporting on over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. But this one, actually, this isn't going to save any treasurers any money, because this was proposing something small but an additional cost, which we've now discovered actually that's not going to be worth an additional investment. In fact, what it reflects on was the power of the original PL. It was excellent PL and it was sustained. It helped change the practice of those teachers, and it was still evident 12 months on.
Now, initial teacher education programs, they're expected to reflect AERO's core content. What's at stake here? How confident are you that this shift will create better classroom-ready graduates moving forward?
Oh, that is the million-dollar question. I am entirely confident that if this is implemented as intended and well across all of our teacher training institutions, it is going to result in excellent, confident, capable, knowledgeable graduates. But we have 47 training doing initial teacher education across the country. They were all told they would need to have their courses updated to reflect the core content by the end of 2025. There will be a quality assurance process to make sure that the new courses that they're offering are consistent with the expectations, and every provider has to have their content accredited by the regulatory authority in their state and territory. But I am going to be hopeful, but a little nervous until I see the results of some of the quality assurance work that's being done. The quality assurance will be quite a rigorous inspection of what's actually being taught in courses. What is the response of the teachers who are being trained? What is their experience in their practicum in school settings? How do they fare when they're actually in classrooms? It's going to be looking over the course of a number of years at a range of different providers and really getting under the hood of what they say they're doing to make sure that it is consistent with what ministers are intending with this reform.
So note to self, if we're intending to have more children, hold off a couple of years, because by the time they come through, teaching, whoa.
Oh, look, there are some pretty splendid practitioners out there right now. And I should say that in some of the jurisdictions, the ministers who you recited earlier have taken up all of our research around explicit instruction, classroom management, etc., and said, this is the way we're doing things here. This is New South Wales. This is Victoria. This is Tasmania. So, you've got some teachers who are well supported by their ministers and their systems to be extremely good practitioners right now.
Jenny, you're now 5 years in, and I believe the good news is that the focus on explicit instruction and evidence-based classroom management shows it's effective. We've been talking about how we ensure teachers make their learning stick. How do you help spread this nationally and ensure it sticks?
Well, we've been conscious since the outset that our audience can't just be teachers, because we can't direct teachers. We're not employing, well, I do employ teachers. A lot of my staff are actually teaching backgrounds, but we're not the ones in the position to tell them how to do their job. So we do direct a lot of our content to teachers, and we promote our work, and we talk at all of their conferences, and we hope that they will come to the website and download the material and view the videos and make adjustments to their practice. But our other audience needs to be the systems, the departments of education, the Catholic diocese and the independent schools as well, because they do have the channels and the leverage to be saying directly to their teachers, this is the way we want you to be doing your work. This is the evidence that we are drawing on. These are the resources we think are important, valuable, quality assured and high quality. So I'm pleased to say that not quite 5 years in, that's exactly what we're seeing happen. Minister Ben Carroll in Victoria, Minister Prukar, who's currently on leave, but Courtney Hussos in her absence in New South Wales, in Tasmania, in Northern Territory. Around the country, we're seeing right from the very top, the ministers say this is the approach that we are confident is going to improve the learning outcomes for our students. It has a robust evidence base behind it. It has demonstrated resources that are available, and this is how we're going to be doing the work of education in our state and territory going forward. So it's fantastic to see that, and we are beginning to see the impact in terms of student learning outcomes. Every year, NAPLAN generates all the stories, and among them, invariably, you get the stories about the turnaround schools, the schools where maybe they had very disadvantaged populations, they started doing things differently, look at their new NAPLAN results. every time you get a story like that, it's because the turnaround is based on them adopting explicit teaching practices and making sure their teachers know how to go about doing their teaching so that the learning improves. It's a successful, proven recipe, and it's not surprising to me, and it is very gratifying to me that entire systems are taking it up in the way they are.
It is heartening from my perspective as a taxpayer and a parent of school attending children that we have responsive ministers who are getting it. And because my fear is always beautiful theory and no disinterest and bureaucracy going on the way it always has. And somehow AERO is helping be the catalyst to bring these together, as along with obviously inherent interests.
Yeah, it was a risk, Steve. I thought when they set up this organisation that they could all pat themselves on the back and say, good job done, now we're evidence-based. But they actually haven't been complacent. What they've done is listen and attend to, and then use that evidence to make very important reforms across their entire system. So good on them, I say.
Now, earlier on we mentioned equity. The other two areas AERO's focusing on, and this interview is going out at the beginning of 2026, disability and First Nations. Can you give us a sense of what this will look like practically? What sort of initiatives should teachers be expecting to see roll out?
So equity, we've known, has been a challenge. It was one of the challenges that the ministers identified when we were first set up. And as we noted earlier, the equity gap doesn't improve in schooling at the moment. So one of the big priority areas that ministers gave us to look at for 2025 and will carry into 2026 has been equity. What is the story? And the work we've done in 2025 has built off some other research looking at concentrations of disadvantage, the fact that across the country we have more disadvantaged, more concentrated in some areas than we've seen before. And we're trying to understand what is the impact of that. The reality is, if we want to close equity gaps, it is about making sure that every child, no matter what their background or where they are going to school, has the same access to really good teaching. But that isn't the case. In fact, what we know is that some of the most disadvantaged children aren't getting access to those effective teaching practices that we know will make the difference. So figuring out how we're going to shift at a system level, at a school level, some of the things that are embedding that situation is the task for 2026. In terms of disability, that has been a problem that's really emerged and grown over the years that we've been around. And in 25, the ministers said they wanted us to take a close look at that. What we've identified is that we have an increasing number of children with identified disabilities in mainstream classroom settings, and that's having a very big impact on the teachers and the way they can manage their good practice in given that they have more children with different kinds of needs. What we're going to be doing in 2026 is a national survey to find out exactly how that's playing out within classrooms, because again, we've got a good sense of what needs to be done to tackle the problem, but we want a bit more insight into the kinds of practices that are having a very positive effect for those children, so that we can be much more confident in the advice that we would make available as a result. So 26 will be a further exploration.
You mean, sorry, you mean you're going to gather evidence?
Yes, it is part of what we get to do. There's a lot of research out there, but there are a lot of gaps in what we know. And this is one of those areas. There's been a particular explosion in the number of children identified with autism and autism spectrum disorders in mainstream settings. And that is changing the experience of teaching and learning in classrooms. So understanding what is the impact of that and how teachers are trying to manage it at the moment is important to know.
And I interjected as you were about to put your focus on First Nations.
which is your right. You are the host. With First Nations, what we're interested in is around the country there have been a number of approaches to looking at curriculum and teaching with children who are First Nations children and teachers, First Nations teachers, that look at trying to have an element of the approach that is First Nations led. So it's sometimes described as two ways learning, the way that First Nations knowledges and practices can be incorporated into the curriculum that is delivered in the classroom. And that's happening anecdotally with some success in certain areas. So we're having a close look at some of those to see, what is the impact on the learning outcomes for First Nations children, but also what might be able to be adapted from some of these approaches that would actually benefit all children. We would like all of our children to know more about First Nations knowledges and practices. So if there's something that's working really well, we'd like to surface that and be able to share it.
And I think that's a theme that's emerged through our interviews in 2025. There's a sense that if we get things right, whether it's for First Nations, disability, equity, it actually lifts all boats.
Yes, absolutely. And what I like about this project is it's taking a strengths-based approach to our research. It's not coming, as research so often does, from a point of, oh gosh, here's a dreadful problem, here's a deficiency, how do we fix it? In fact, it's saying there's something out there that's got some magic and we want to understand it better because it could help, as you say, float everybody.
Well, I hope we get to talk in 6 months' time and you can question me and see if any of this did stick. My sense is it will have. Dr. Jenny Donovan, thank you very much for joining me around the school table.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Steve. The time flew.